My name is Joel Dixon. I'm based in Atlanta. I'm a real estate developer. Urban Oasis Development is the firm I started. My original background was actually in technology, so this is my second career. But even before that, in Atlanta, street life is dear to my heart because I actually grew up in the projects. Public housing in the 80s, urban decline, crack cocaine. Some of my best friends were dealers, some of the also original street life and street commerce that still exists today. And I carry a lot of that with me, even as I do development. And so I'm very excited to walk through some of that. As a real estate developer, though, what I really wanted to do is figure out how do we recreate these places, right? These spaces for street life and for interactivity and for real community. And that's what I get to do. And one of the things that I was really impressed with was one of the groups that really developed me was a group called Incremental Development Alliance. And this tagline now that's noted here became one of my hallmarks, which is cities are better when they're built, maintained, and owned by locals. At the end of the day, when it was being mentioned that Trilliff, the town of Trilliff, which is a phenomenal development for many reasons, but that it still feels sterile, right? It feels authentic even when you have murals, is because it's not yet really owned by locals. And the reason why is to Kathleen's point, I love that idea of loose versus tight. And in this country, we have a tightness and we like things clean. We like things sterile. We like perception of safety. And this is literally the antitheses to local and street and authentic, to be honest with you. If we're being completely authentic, we are messy individuals, personally. Everything else is just a facade. And so what we try to do with Urban Oasis Development is think about how we can continue to push it down to those who are in a community, in a neighborhood. Now, Atlanta happens to be my home sweet home, so it makes it a lot easier when I started in this community right here, which is actually where I was raised. So this is a mural that's in the neighborhood of Casberry Hills and West End, are known right now for the historically Black colleges, Spelman, Morehouse, Clark, Atlanta, etc. Also known where Dr. King and his family was living while he was doing the civil rights movement. But this is just where I grew up. So it was a public housing project that was there, torn down as a part of Urban Renewal, Hope 6, and rebuilt. But this mural remains. And so what we started looking at was, once again, structurally, how do you recreate this stuff? And for us, we have this concept called your farm. And your farm is exactly how farmers actually do things, which is when you're farming, you do not extract, you do not take advantage of, because you need the land to continue to produce for you year after year. And that's what we look at when we think about developing in neighborhoods, which automatically reinforces street life. Because when we're trying to create an entire neighborhood, this is street by street, block by block, but it's also building by building. And this just happens to be an example of looking at something in that context. I was just talking to Kathleen about a project in Atlanta, an area called South Downtown. And it really is going to need to take advantage of this because it has a lot of buildings on it. But one way that you can start activating is going back to some of the presentations already displayed, which is, okay, how do you launch with what we call in the tech industry, minimum viable project? And that is not stuff that's clean and sterile. This is stuff that people know how to do since the beginning of time, which is put up a tent, lay out a blanket and put your wares on there. Just show up with something that people want. And this particular street market actually is in Texas, an area called Duncanville. Many of my auntie, who does a lot of work in Duncanville, South Dallas, and does a lot of trainings and things. But this was his project that he helped launch as he was thinking about his own farm. And it was extremely successful. It was extremely diverse. It was extremely street. It was extremely inclusive. And it was something that launched what eventually became more of a determined marketplace. And because at time I didn't want to show everything, but that's what we mean by you can launch with that kind of stuff even today. And while there are regulations, as Kathleen mentioned, around permitting, things like that, we'll work within that context, but you still can enable it. And I highly recommend it. Now, some of the ways that this progresses, however, and I think that was made very clear also early in the presentation, is that can go from unorganized, or let's just call it very dynamic, to something that's more stable, or dynamic being like temporary changes, let's pop up, to something that's more established. And that's when you start getting like storefronts. But even in that concept, the idea is that those storefronts are now owned by locals. is that even if they get to move away from being a food truck, that you don't displace them, you just replace them into now a permanent location. And that contributes to a healthy environment and specifically a healthy neighborhood development because you now have locals that are in these established places, which are going to maintain automatically authenticity. I don't have to get them to try to figure out if they want to do a mural in their building. I don't have to get them to try to figure out how to keep this feeling like the community because they're in the community. They're going to do that by themselves. And I don't even need to, as a developer, try to overanalyze and be like, yo, let's create this cool, gritty effect. No, just let locals inhabit your spaces. That will be a byproduct. And this is a quick example. So we have these two different side-by-side comparisons. Dunkin' Donuts, I'm sure many of them love. America runs on Dunkin', right? But let's be honest, like this creates a sterile environment. And it's actually extractive economically. But beyond that, it's just not really a sense of space and place. And I would argue, like many others have, that there are a lot of people that can fry some sugar and make some coffee. And so on the right, we see an example of a donut shop, right? That is right in Duncanville in the area that I mentioned earlier. And it looks different, right? Once again, you could argue and say, oh, that the Dunkin' looks very gritty, it's on brand. I know what it looks like. This place over here, one has one facade, the other one has another facade, but that's the whole point. This is what makes this now feel like an authentic place I want to visit if I was in town, because I can go anywhere in America and see a Dunkin' Donuts shop. And that just reinforces that your neighbors do it better than anybody else. So empower and enable, and that's what we try to do as a development company, for them to succeed, for them to have a space and a place. And once again, this doesn't look like street life. And so that's why I want to also add into the component to say not everything has to look disheveled. But I would still argue that this looks much more like a street place that you want to be at than your average sterile commercial marketplace or street. This is a quick example of another one of my colleagues up in Buffalo who works a lot with locals to enable them to get spaces and places. This happened to be a shop owner who she enabled to actually co-own the space at this point, launch this space interior. They have a beautiful mural, which I didn't get to include here. But a part of this is also how you develop and enable your neighbors, not just creating space, but in this case, she worked with this business owner where that person could eventually apply for a loan, get work done internally, actually co-own the building and the space that they're in. And this is also very important because street life, while it's great, is by definition a lot of times temporary, which is why people get displaced. And so we're also trying to create this happy mix of pop-up and temporary, but also permanent and local, so that also as things develop, there's still that local authenticity, and ownership is the only way in that case. And then I wanted to end, or at least from this portion, with Monty again, where he's now taking that street life market and actually took that into a physical marketplace, but the same ideology, which is inside of this space, was all types of local vendors who had an opportunity to continue to sell goods and services, including the youngest among them. And that was two young kids, 10 and 12-year-old, who have a snow cone operation. And so this is an example of something we're doing back in my neck of the woods of Atlanta. It's a neighborhood, Main Street, that's been left behind, just like so many others. I love how it was mentioned about blight, and I learned recently that blight is the coin word that allows people to come in and take over so that they can own and control and gentrify. So I try not to use that word, but really what it is that we have a lot of buildings that have been neglected and left behind. But what we wanted to do was retake back that type of commercial building, in this case, a 7,000 square foot building, and then figure out how do we do this and activate this space. We know fundamentally what we wanted to do, which is bring healthy food into there. We wanted to bring some small entrepreneurs. We wanted to add some affordable mixed housing above it. But how to enable that was something that we were really thinking about. Now, this became a design that we came up with. And this design looks great and phenomenal and fantastic, right, from the outside. But this design actually came from a lot of community engagement. And the final design will have other components that's not shown here, because this was for our building permits. But this is who's involved and was involved in that entire process. A whole bunch of neighborhood folks who we held in-person charrettes, and I hate to even call them charrettes, because they weren't formalized. It wasn't like we hired an architect and sent people around and put green and red dots on things. We were just like, look, here's this building. Here's this wall. We spray painted on it. Write on here what you want to see. Like, let us know. Just tell us. Like, this is really all we really want to know. And then we had some other spaces where people could put, their own ad hoc ideas. And so we had these Post-it notes. Once again, very simple. We wanted to make it multi-generational. You can see this young lady was able to bring her daughter. We actually had young kids who also could give their perspective. We had older, more established seniors who could give their perspective, because at the end of the day, the community and the authenticity of the street life is everybody, right? It's not just one particular group. And this is a set of components around that particular building that exists today. It's a very art-centered community. It has a lot of art, music, entertainment, performance. It has actually a food truck park, which, just as a brief aside, this is an example where food truck parks and things like that can be great. But in this case, this food truck park got shut down because it became a victim of its own success. It was so successful, there was really no parking design around it. Nobody had been in this area for 20 years doing any commerce. So many people started coming that it created traffic. It created parking issues. It created all of now this dysfunctionality that, of course, the neighbors started being like, oh, this is a terrible idea now, even though they literally have been asking for food in any respect for a while. And so this is what, as a developer, I constantly have to think about, because these are the pros and cons and the tension around creating that. Now, I wanted to give some other examples of what we really try to do with a street life perspective, which is create spaces that are not just for commerce, but for play and for activity and for people to come together. Atlanta has a lot of parks and green spaces that they literally just neglected or actually give away. They just give back. They just say, we're abandoning this. How does a city abandon a green space that they own? What does that even mean? But this is what the city of Atlanta does sometimes. And so in this case, this was an actual location that was left behind. We worked with the neighborhood and the community, including doing a design day around an Easter egg hunt. We included, once again, multi-generations to really impact and show what it is that they wanted to do. If we're going to create a playground, they're the ones who best know that, but also older and seniors who said, hey, this is what we used to do when there were green spaces and outside spaces. And so we incorporated all of that in a process that eventually led to a final design, to the first park and green space in this area that now is full of people who get to congregate and develop. And so the last two examples, I'm going to go very quickly. I try to work with creatives and artists who are very, by definition, gritty and grimy. Tyree Smith is one. He started a group called Artlanta. We've worked with him on a variety of projects, including a fair that was put together by locals, not Barnum and Bailey, that had to be brought in from the outside. We worked with them on a site in Chattahoochee Hills for a charter school to really activate and launch it. And we're working right now on a 70-acre site that we're developing. And so with that, a lot of the process is, for me, very intentional, but it's intentionally inclusive. And I don't try to figure out everything. I just include the right people. So the last 2 minutes, maybe a minute and a half, this is street life that everybody was thinking about as they entered into this presentation. This is an example of a group of young boys called Water Boys. It's something that had existed in Atlanta for years and years, just commerce being enacted by young people. Buying water, selling it on the street. We gave the example of, you're not going to go to the store to buy the water, but if somebody comes up to your car, guess what? You're buying the water. Over the course of time, this became somewhat negative. There was some violence involved, but once again, just the dysfunctionality of it that some people didn't want to have happen. And so police started rounding up these guys, basically incarcerating them, created a whole situation. But out of that conversation, the idea was like, hey, these boys are just trying to do something good. And like I said, I grew up in real street commerce, which was the drug industry, which is what these boys, when I was younger, would have been doing to create money. So the fact that they weren't selling heroin or some other form of drug is a benefit. Now we just had to empower them to do it in a way that maybe was a little bit more structured. That led to a company being started called the Water Boys in the Hood. They got funded through the city. They got worked with groups like Helping Empower Youth to get some training on business and organization. And then from there, they're now organized in directly as a union, not really a union. And that's led to other opportunities for them to take their entrepreneurship with even a business that sold frozen ice cream, who said, hey, will you all run our carts that we can put now on street corners? And guess what? Yes, they can, right? This is what they already have been doing. And I'm very excited with what and how we're trying to enable, once again, from the urban development perspective, this kind of street life environment. That's my contact information. Thank you all so much for your time.
This guy always parked in front of the Denver Union Station in the morning and sold coffee from his car. For a while, it was the COVID and you couldn't get coffee. The stores were closed and he was so valuable. I'm just going to talk about how you create economy and what's the role of the regulation very quickly. So, diversity, inclusion, resilience. Those are really interrelated and they support each other. What we mean by diversity, people actively businesses within close proximity. And when you diversify the businesses that much, you get your essential services close to you. And that's resilience. The self-reliance. Once you're blocked, if you don't get TP, like we did that, right, in the beginning of the COVID, toilet paper, somebody next to you is selling that already. So you don't need to go to the big supermarket and make supply. So that's the whole idea. That is to say, getting what you need next to you. And all these interrelationships I explored in my climate resilience, and I'm not going to talk about that much. Let's move forward. It's just commercials. Inclusion of small local businesses and businesses that own their property, that's a very key, are very important in creating local economies. Strong local economy. Here are some interesting examples I love. This is in Turkey, and you don't see it well, but it's a very chic beach town. It's an old town, and the shore properties are very expensive. But this particular building stayed there for a long time. Apparently kept it there. And it's a tiny little barber shop, and that's the kind of thing you need that adds. I live in Loma, Colorado. These are some examples. I called it a mistake in zoning. They forgot to ban the non-residential uses in some historic neighborhoods, and therefore we have these beautiful businesses. The middle one is my dentist across my house, actually. And during the COVID, when I needed some work, I went to my neighbor, where all other dentists were not functioning because you can't really trust, and you need to be. But that's the whole thing. We created pods, right? How diverse that pod was a big importance, because if it's a monoculture, then you're vulnerable. If it is diverse, you get all those services. So how do you create this? It's a big question. Zoning matters. Now, we urbanists usually say, oh, mixed use, high density, great. And we see these zoning all the time. Okay, we're going to change this corridor, we're going to do mixed use. And then this is what happens. Look at the old fabric, beautiful oriental theater. Next door is a 4-story mixed use residential building. Mixed use because they're required to do non-residential ground floor. They do some rec center or weights and such, and then build this blank facade and kill the neighborhood. We need to find a way to include the prototypes I just showed before. The small businesses that own their land and building. And that can be done with zoning. We just did the city of Golden, it's a town in Colorado, as you know, their zoning ordinance. And what we said is that the way the conventional zoning works is that if it's retail, it's Main Street building, goes to the sidewalk. There are a lot of non-residential uses in the residential fabric. What do we do? What do we do with those? If you give the right to go to the sidewalk, we're going to really demolish the whole area. So we said, no, do some lot tax. This is a compound, multi-blade use basically. But this area is zoned residential or commercial, meaning that maybe for a while this is going to be a small business. But that doesn't mean that this cannot be a small business either, or residential. So you give that what we call agility of market to adapt to the space idea to the zoning. So I'm just going to go very fast. Other example, we'll also look at, can we do a little bit bigger building but still fit into that context of the cottagey small town feel and give the opportunities and in terms of the disposition different spaces. Here's another example where it's almost like a townhome side by side. And again, the front building is much more non-residential The back can be residential. Another example is a new community, Springville, Utah. As you can see, there are two centers, but with a really long main street in between. How do you animate that? How do you create the diversity of the businesses you need? This is a concept-based plan. In T6, you have your typical mixed-use large buildings. But what we said, through the corridor, let's come up with other prototypes where actually you subdivide the land into tiny little, almost like a row home, lots, and give the opportunity for a startup, small business, 800 square feet, 1,000 square feet space, opportunity, so that business can buy that building and the land underneath. It's a feasible. And that's so valuable. And there's a huge market, untapped market. Those businesses go to the shopping malls and such, unfortunately, where they're so valuable to create life in the neighborhood.
Where they can't survive.
Yeah. And another example, we call these back-to-back townhomes. But again, in terms of the zoning, there's the flexibility of retail, commercial, neighborhood service businesses to go behind the lines. That is to say, in the future, if there's more demand, some of these units can be occupied by lawyers and professionals and so on. Build that into the zoning ordinance. Beyond zoning, permit street food. It's so valuable. These pictures are from Puerto Vallarta. And what happened there is that there was a big discussion and such. Usually there's this, from the regular commerce, restaurants and such, there's this opposition. Oh, no, I'm paying taxes. I have no space. I don't want that. They turned around that. They realized that it's mutually supportive. If there's a vendor, there is more clients coming into your restaurant as well. And municipality provided electricity and water. That is crucial for sanitation, cleanliness. And those two are from Denver. Old pasta structures. Now they are small businesses. There's a haircut place, and that is it's a jewelry, but actually they fix watches, and I usually lose my glass screw. It is so valuable to have one of those because okay, I'll fix it, don't worry. Right there on your face. Again, the agility of the market. We have all sorts of needs, and if we provide the agility in the regulatory system, then we can really enable those kind of businesses to come to you. In conclusion, small local ownership is important, enables strong local economy, sustains life, sustaining social interaction, etc. So I'm gonna leave you with a question and a concept that Kathleen already talked about, the looseness and tightness. And it's a great book about loose space. And we're talking about appropriating a territory for an unplanned activity. The street musicians, they play marginal over there, demonstrations, etc. The importance is that it creates a sense of ownership and pride. Self-expression is important. Public space should be a place for express reflection and social interaction, and they become third places. Looseness increases with discretion. That is to say, if I feel like I own this place, I can create something and use that space. Now, dancing on the street, that's a good example. You remember where that picture is from?
West Side Story.
West Side Story, yes. The thing is, West Side Story is a story of confrontation. Two individuals fight with each other. Through that fight, they get to know each other. And that happens in public realm. Then the question comes, how much conflict? How much tolerance? And that's a very important because a lot of the time, we want mixed use and so forth, the New Urban is bad. Let's clean it up. I don't want any conflict. I don't want any disturbance. But then you stop and think about it. Maybe that's exactly what you want. To a degree, and what is that degree is the question. Thank you.